So hi and welcome to a new edition of You Are My Borough with myself, Scott Wilson and Dom Shaw from the Northern Echo. Thanks for coming along. We're obviously in the summer break, but we've got plenty to talk about from a Borough perspective. We're going to have a chat about the interview that we did earlier this week with Kieran Scott and kind of everything that came out of that. Some really interesting stuff from that, I think, about where Borough are heading this summer. We'll touch on Aaron Danks and whether he is Germany bound. And then we'll have a general chat about kind of where Borough are and how the summer is shaping up in these early days. How are you, Dom? How's your summer shaping up?
I'm all wet. Summer.
Wet,
cold. It's ringing out there today.
Right, isn't it?
Like an autumn day, isn't it? Well, when we were at Rockliffe yesterday, we came out, didn't we, and said, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I would have liked to have been out on that course, but it would have been a tough old day on that course yesterday, wouldn't it?
The way that wild, wasn't it?
Yeah,
we'll get into it, but it was like Fort Knox at Rockliffe yesterday, wasn't it? Because a certain collection of footballers related to Gareth Southgate are there, the old England squad training with screens up all around the training ground and everything. It was like, I don't know.
I had a bizarre moment coming out when there was like a queue coming in, and because I think the players were doing all the commercial stuff yesterday, weren't they? So there was obviously plenty of interviews and what have you taking place, and I had a bizarre moment when I'm coming out and there's a queue coming in and a queue coming out, so the security guys there were obviously directing in and out, and I got like stuck in a bit of a halfway house, and I didn't know whether to go forward or back, and then when I looked to the left, there was Kieran Trippier, Jared Bowen, and who was the other? There was Jordan Pickford. I stood like waiting for me to make my mind up. I'm like, this isn't a good look.
Don't run over Jordan Pickford.
Oh, Christ, no. But it was good to see, wasn't it? It was good to see.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was really interesting. Yeah, it'll be interesting, obviously, to see how they get on with Newcastle on Monday night. But anyway, Borough. So yes, we were there. As I say, got the opportunity to have a chat with Kieran Scott. Fair play to Kieran and Borough. He tends to do that with us, kind of before and after windows, just to give a bit of guidance on where things are at, answer a few questions. We were there. Craig from the Gazette was there. Mark Drury from Tees was there. I mean, what were you kind of, obviously, you know, some of the stuff we've written about already. There'll be bits and bobs more over the next few days. But what were your kind of key takeaways from it in terms of, you know, the summer and where Borough are at and what they're hoping to do?
I think we'll kind of get onto the overall picture, but the three kind of, I think, strong news lines to come out of it was quality over quantity is what Borough are looking for in terms of ins this summer. The kind of fiercely strong desire to make sure there's no high profile outs this summer, and also the Aaron Danks stuff, which like this whole company Bayern Danks, it's just one of the stories that you could never have predicted, could you, a few weeks ago? And as of yesterday or Thursday, when obviously we were over at Rockliffe, there hadn't been an official approach, but they're expecting one, aren't they? Yeah. It's clear they're expecting one. And as Kieran said, Aaron Danks has got a difficult decision to make there, but how do you turn down Bayern Munich? What Kieran did say was Bayern have obviously got to do things right, and there's clearly a compensation figure that Bayern would have to reach. Danks has worked with company before. So that is probably one where we're expecting it now. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that was very much the kind of mood music that seemed to be, look, you know, we'll say all the right things and we'll do all the right things. But the harsh reality is, if Bayern Munich come in and want your assistant manager, Bayern Munich are going to get your assistant manager. And the noises coming out of Germany, while there hasn't been a formal approach yet, it was almost a sense of, well, there's no smoke without fire. The links are there. It feels like it's going to happen. I mean, like you were saying there, you know, if you made a list of 1 to 10,000 of the number of the things that could happen at Borough this summer, losing your assistant manager to Bayern Munich would be quite low down it. But I mean, I guess it says an awful lot for Borough's judgment in bringing Danks in, the fact that his next move is potentially to Bayern Munich. But I suppose it also shows that for all you can do planning, for all you can look at this, the reality of the football world is stuff just happens out the blue sometimes, and you've got to react to it, haven't you?
And I think we've had a few reminders of that. The Morgan Rogers one was a clear reminder of that in January. And in recent weeks, the company one and Maresca to Chelsea is another one, isn't it, where you think, well, no one could see that coming. And I think that's the thing, that for all Boro are absolutely determined to keep hold of their star players this summer, and it would take astronomical fees to tempt them into doing business. You can never say never in football because of the evidence of what we've seen in recent weeks. I thought what was interesting on Danks was we talked to Kieran about how he'd be replaced, and he talked about how maybe the dynamic of Boro's coaching team is different to other championship coaching teams, in that you've got Michael Carrick and two first team coaches rather than assistants in Danks and Woodgate. Now, obviously, you've got Ledbetter in there as well. So whether Ledbetter would potentially step up, whether someone else would come in as a first team coach, Kieran said he thinks there'd be someone coming in, but it's clearly something that's going to be assessed as and when the Danks thing goes through and in the coming weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, and I must stress that this isn't something that we really spoke to Kieran Scott directly about, but it just triggered my thought there when you said it. I mean, when you say you can never say never, and things unexpected can happen, I guess the real wild card in that from Boro this summer, whenever, is Carrick, isn't it? Clearly at the moment, nobody is round Michael. I've got to admit, with all the merry-go-round that's been going on, I'm slightly surprised that Carrick's name hasn't really been mentioned or touted yet. Now, Leicester are now going to be looking for a manager. Boro would not be doing their job if they weren't starting to think about what might happen if the worst happened around Carrick. Now, all the soundings that we're getting is that Carrick is very close to signing a new deal that should go through this summer. There's no complications there. He's very, very, bought into everything that's happening at Boro. Yeah, absolutely. If Man United come for him tomorrow, Michael Carrick's going to Man United. Boro have to kind of plan for that, don't they, to a degree?
Yeah, and I think you would think that had been in place since probably last summer when it became clear kind of what Boro had in Michael Carrick and how at some point down the line it felt inevitable, probably still feels inevitable now that a club will come in. But whereas last summer it was probably more of a live feel last summer, I think, because of how well they've done. And yet this summer, although there's been nothing yet, as you say, when you look at the type of head coaches that other clubs are going for, Maresca to Chelsea, for example, nobody would have seen that one coming. Then, Boro will have to future-proof, won't they? As you say, all the indications at the minute is that Michael Carrick's new contract will be confirmed in the coming weeks, and there's no real bigger commitment than that, is there, from a head coach's perspective? And I think, just coming back to what we were saying right at the start, when the difference between last time we were over at Rockliffe, I think it was a couple of years ago. Was it just before Carrick's first January window in charge? Maybe I'd have to double check, but
I think it might have been before last summer.
Right, was it? Anyway, but Kieran was saying then, wasn't he, about how it still felt like Boro were in a transition really to what they were trying to become. I think from everything that was said to us this week, and just from the outside looking in, it's clear that Boro are well down that path now. Everyone's pulling in the same direction. Everyone's on board with the kind of model and what they're trying to do. It feels a very healthy club, doesn't it, behind the scenes?
It does. Yeah, it does. How many times on previous vids have we looked back at the past and said it was clear that wasn't the case, and there were tensions, and the recruitment team were doing one thing, the head coach was doing another, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's
and you've written about it today, haven't you? Yeah, you've written about comparison with what's going on up the road.
Yeah, I've just done a kind of a comparison piece, which I think between Boro and Sunderland, and the fact that this time last year, Boro and Sunderland felt like they were effectively inhabiting the same place. They just missed out on the playoffs. They were losing key loanees. They needed to sign a striker, but they had a head coach in place who was popular, who'd been there for a year or so, and felt like they were pretty embedded into what was going on. There was general positivity and optimism around both clubs. Now, you can argue that actually Boro didn't quite get it right last summer, In the end, they had too much rebuilding to do. They didn't start the season well enough, and that ultimately probably cost them a realistic tilt at the playoffs. That said, where they're at now is a situation where they feel very stable. The head coach is clearly well embedded there, massively popular. The recruitment's already underway. I mean, Luke Ayling already through the door. Certainly the indications are that they know exactly what they want. They know who they want. Yes, they might not get the first choices, but they know. There's a pretty strong determination right from the top that we'll touch on in a minute that they're not going to get rid of key players. Well, compare that to Sunderland, and my goodness me, no head coach. At the minute, no real idea, I don't think, about where they're going with a head coach, or at least it doesn't feel like that. Star players being linked with exits left, right, and centre, and uncertainty over when and how the club will look to sell and whether that is a massively integral part of their project. I'm sure they'll have targets and talks will have been underway, but how far down the line can their recruitment be when they don't have a head coach? You know, it just feels like there's so much fans, you know, thoroughly disillusioned by what happened in the last 2 months of last season, as opposed to Boro, where the last 2 months created real positivity. It does feel like the two clubs have gone in massively different directions in the space of 12 months. Now, you know, that's not to say that Boro just have to click their fingers and everything will be great and they're battling for the playoffs. Football doesn't work like that. But it does feel like they're coming at it from a much more stable and a much stronger place.
And you touched on the ins and outs there. We'll talk about the ins first. As you say, Luke Ayling's already come in, which is a big boost. Because for all Ayling said after the final game that it was close and it was clear that everybody wanted it, it wasn't a foregone conclusion because there was real concrete interest in Ayling. Chris Wilder was really keen on taking him to Sheffield United. And at 32, this was probably Ayling's last or one of his last kind of big deals. So it had to be right for everyone. So fair play to Boro for getting that over the line. If things go to plan in the coming weeks, months, then he'll be followed through the door by a midfielder, which we know is a priority, a number 10 or a versatile forward player, and a striker. Latte Lath's form, clearly Latte Lath is going to start next season as the first choice centre forward. But Boro still want to strengthen in that area, and understandably so. We've talked about that, haven't we, in recent weeks?
Yeah, and you know, that's no surprise at all, is it? Because as we've said, Latte Lath's done absolutely brilliantly, has massively earned the right to start next season as the number one. But there are question marks over Josh Coburn, clearly over his injury record. I think there's still question marks over the extent to which he can be a number one striker in the Championship week in, week out. Because, you know, while there were flashes of that in the first half of the season, he never really stayed fit enough for that to be put to the test. You know, can he do it month after month after month? Well, in that scenario, you know, you definitely need another striker. Now, you know, we've touched about this. Does it have to be an out-and-out number 9? Probably not necessarily. But you do need somebody who can either play with Latte Lath or who can be real competition for Latte Lath. And then I think the way Boro have to look at it is if Coburn then comes into the mix and is a genuine part of that conversation next season, that's probably a bonus, but you can't rely on that. So, yeah, I mean, no surprise at all that that's a priority. No surprise at all that an attacker coming in off the left is going to be a priority, given that Greenwood, obviously, the option wasn't taken up. They've lost Rodgers, they've lost Crooks. So no surprise at all that that's a priority. And then centre mid, clearly, they're a body short there with Lewis O'Brien having gone back to Forest.
And when it comes to outs, there are 3 players really who immediately spring to mind. It would have been 2 a couple of months ago, wouldn't it? Vandenberg and Hackney, yeah. But Latte Lath's undoubtedly played his way into that category. And Kieran Scott, when he spoke to us, when he spoke to Mark Drury from BBC Tees, couldn't have been any stronger, could he really? There always has to be the kind of asterisk attached of, like, if a club comes and bids silly money, then clearly it's out of our hands. But I think the phrase he used was Steve Gibson's as fiery as he's ever known him on this subject in his desire to keep the players. And as he said, if we want to go up next year, we can't lose our best players.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he was quite keen to drop Steve Gibson into there is telling, really, because ultimately at a club like Boro, you know, realistically, the sporting director can say what he wants, but if the owner decides he wants to go in a different direction, the owner will go in a different direction. Now, yesterday, as I say, Kieran Scott couldn't really be strong enough saying to us, look, this isn't just me. This is right from Steve that, we do not want to sell those 3 players. Now, as you quite rightly drop in, who knows? If Arsenal decide they really like Hayden Hackney and are willing to pay £40 million for him, Hayden Hackney goes. But Boro are a championship club with no parachute payments. That's the ultimate bottom line of it when it comes to finances. So, there comes a point where money has to talk. But at the moment, that point seems a long way off for those 3 players. And there is a really strong determination that it's going to take, absolutely, we cannot turn this down offers for anything to happen with those 3 players. And, while all 3 of them are, potentially that level of player in the future, I think there's justifiable reasons why that's probably unlikely this summer. I mean, Latterlath, yes, brilliant, but really for 2 or 3 months. Rav van den Berg, massive, massive potential as a teenager, but still has only had 1 season in the championship. Hayden Hackney, a little bit further down the progression line, but hasn't kicked the ball since February. So, I think I'd be surprised if Boro got a we can't turn this down offer in the mould of what they had for Morgan Rogers for any of those 3 players this summer.
And I think a key point is all 3 players, from everything we hear, from all the indications, are happy. Now, yeah. I know you could well say that Morgan Rogers was happy going into January, but then the club his family supported when he was a boy, who were going to play Champions League football, come in for him. And obviously situations change, but none of these players are going to be angling for a move this summer. None of these players are going to be making life difficult for Boro behind the scenes. Rav van den Berg spoke openly, hasn't he, about the reason he joined Boro in the first place is really the reason why he thinks it's the right place to stay this summer, to keep playing, to keep being a key player. Hayden Hackney's obviously spoke about the fact he's living a dream playing for his hometown club. And Latterlath, well, we've heard from his agent who made pretty clear that we're not going to be angling for a move. Yeah, there might be interest, probably inevitable, really, when you've got a 25-year-old striker scoring so many goals and in such good form in the championship. But again, in his words, we're not going to be angling for a move this summer.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Now, again, if AC Milan come in for Latterlath, that changes things, doesn't it? But at the moment, it doesn't feel like that kind of level of interest is likely for any of the 3. So I think it's very positive that Boro are saying, look, it's going to take something absolutely wildly out of the blue for us to do anything on that stance. Because, and I think Kieran Scott even said this, how can you say to everybody, we want to be fighting for promotion next season, and then you sell your star striker? Now, again, we keep coming back to, yes, there's a point where it just has to happen if it hits a certain level. But that's under massive duress and under the understanding that you're taking a sum of money that could potentially transform what you're able to do with the club over the next 2-3 transfer windows. All things being equal, the fact that all 3 look like they're going to be starting next season as Boro players is a massive positive. And to be fair, whoever they bring in, probably the biggest thing that can happen to Boro this summer.
And like, this is obvious, but Kieran had said to Mark in his interview with BBC Tees that this summer feels different because last summer it was the overhaul. They were having to bring in 11, 12 players, losing key men. This summer it kind of feels like you're starting from 1-0 up instead of 1-0 down, really, doesn't it, in the transfer window?
Yeah, well, I think the key difference is, so, if you're a club like Boro, then arguably every transfer window you should be looking to bring in 2, 3, 4 quality additions who can immediately go into your first team, because that's how you grow a club. That's where you're at. The problem last summer was Boro had to do that, but then they also had to bring in 4 or 5 players who were going to flesh out the squad because they'd lost a lot of quality, but just numerically, they were way down on where they needed to be. The difference so as well as bringing in your first team players, you were bringing in your Silveras, your Glovers, your players who you anticipated would be on the bench for most of the season. Actually, a few of them ended up playing an awful lot more, but that, as a result of the injuries. But largely, you were signing first-team players, and you were also signing squad players. This time round, if you can bring in 4 or 5 players who will go into your first team, then the 4 or 5 players they dislodge from that first team become your squad players and are already, way stronger than the squad players you had last season. So that's the ideal scenario, really, you want to be getting in, where if you bring in smatterings of real quality, then the squad improves as a whole anyway, because, as I say, the players they dislodge are of a much higher quality than what have been on the bench for you the season before. And hopefully that'll be where we're at with Boro come the end of August.
And there's the continuity there, isn't there? That Carrick
exactly.
talked so much about like how last season one of the real challenges really was the fact they didn't get that. Carrick said, didn't he? Was it how he felt he'd almost managed 3 or 4 different teams over the course of the season? And you can see that, can't you, when you look at the various different stages of the season and who was playing where. Who would have predicted back in August, September, for example, that Matt Clark could have played such a leading role at the end of the season? So I think that continuity is key as well, moving into next season. It's adding to what's already there, as you say there.
And the other thing you would hope that it will avoid is the horror show of the first month that Boro had last season, which ultimately really cost them the place in the playoffs. What was it? 2 points from 21 or something like that, off the top of my head. I mean, you're absolutely kind of playing catch up from the minute you actually get your team together and start, isn't it? And that was undoubtedly a result, a direct result last year of the number of changes and the fact that, really right up until, well, even beyond the end of pre-season, Carrick didn't really know what his team was going to be, who he had, who he didn't have, all of that. Well, there should not be anything like that uncertainty this season. Come the start of pre-season, Carrick will have the vast majority of the squad that will line up for the first game after the transfer window closes. And that's a really good position to be in.
Fair play. Sorry, fair. You said it at the top, but fair play to Kieran Scott for coming out and doing that. And not just with us, he's done it with various different platforms over the course of the last couple of years. But you know what it's like when someone in that position, when someone in that position of power comes out and speaks on the record, what they're saying is held not against them, but it comes up again and again and again, doesn't it? If you say we're hoping to do this and then you don't do it. So fair play, not for the courage to do it, but for I guess just being so transparent with the fans, because that's clearly who it gets to, isn't it? Although he's speaking to us, it's the fans who he's speaking to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I don't really understand why. I take your point that, Steve Gibson, we're going to smash the league, was kind of held as a stick to beat him with for however long, an off-the-cuff comment that was taken as a kind of modus operandi for how things were going to be. Well, I take that. But I still think that as a club, being open about what you're doing and why you're doing it, that's the way to get the fans on board. I mean, I don't want to keep harking back to Sunderland, but that's really just because I've written this column about comparing the two earlier today. But probably the biggest criticism that Sunderland's ownership are getting at the minute from the fans is the fact that they're just not saying anything about anything. They might have a plan. This all might be part of some grand scheme and plan of what they're trying to do. But because they're not coming out and explaining what they're doing and why they're doing it, it just feels like chaos. Whereas, yes, come 12 months down the line, questions might be being asked of what Kieran Scott's kind of been coming out and saying and said, well, this didn't really happen. Why was that? And he'll have to answer those questions. But that's part of his job. That's part of, I think he's got to take that on board.
And it gets everyone on board. It gets everyone on board.
At least everybody now knows the broad brush of what Boro are trying to do this summer. And I just think that's massively helpful for the fans to kind of know that and be able to have that in the back of their mind when decisions are taken and things happen, why they're happening.
And there is an acceptance. There has to be an acceptance that although Boro or any club kind of want to do a certain thing in a transfer window, there's always an acceptance, you'd hope, that
things change.
Yeah, things change. It's out of their hands at certain elements. But yeah, I think it benefits everyone to kind of know the route Boro are planning. It's the first time we've spoken on here since the Championship playoff final. We now have the full breakdown of the Championship makeup next season. Last year, so much was made, wasn't it, about how strong the Championship was going to be. The 3 teams coming down looked so well equipped to go back up. Obviously, Ipswich looked well equipped, although not many were predicting that they go up automatically. What do you think?
You just about did.
Well, I was going to think I've chirped enough on that, haven't I, over the last we never went back and revisited our predictions in full, did we? No. It's too early to obviously do the full predictions, but at this early stage, what are your kind of early feelings on how? Because it feels like there's so much flux at the minute. Several clubs without a manager. West Brom potentially now losing Corberán to Leicester down the line, if reports this week are to be believed. Again, it goes back to what you were saying, whereas Boro are kind of swimming along nicely with stability. That's certainly not the case for several clubs elsewhere.
No. It doesn't feel like the 3 coming down are as strong, does it?
No,
now, let's see how things pan out. But Sheffield United was shambolic in the Premier League, and
starting on -2 points.
Starting with points off. There's going to be an awful lot of change at that football club. Yes, they'll have parachute money to help with it. Burnley, you would have thought, would probably have been the strongest of the 3, but clearly now there's a massive question mark over the post-Company era. He had his side playing a very, very, very specific style that he clearly wasn't for changing. Well, how will a new manager adapt to that? And then you've got Luton, who, will be strong almost certainly, because there will not be the level of upheaval there. That you would imagine they'll pretty much stick with that squad. But the element of surprise has gone a bit from Luton, which I do think helped them when they went up. Teams know now what they're up against at Kenilworth Road. They know what Luton are capable of. I don't think those 3 are anything like as strong as Leicester, Southampton and Leeds looked even at this stage last summer. Now, Leeds are clearly going to be strong again, although let's see what, there was a lot of talk about their money situation. They've obviously had this influx now from Red Bull, but let's see how that pans out. I'm not certain at the moment about whether Leeds are going to have to sell players or not. But you would imagine they'll be strong. Then you'll have your kind of usual suspects, I guess. West Brom, Norwich, teams who have been up, Coventry, up and round there. Boro are part of that group, but as you've said, are probably the most stable part of that group. All of those clubs, I think, would love to be in the position where Boro are in, where you've got a head coach, you've got the bulk of your squad already there, you've already started your recruitment. It feels like Boro are well set in that group of clubs.
Leeds were poor, weren't they?
Oh, in the final.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're a funny team. They've been a funny team for a big chunk of the season. I mean, we saw that game at the Riverside, which was just utter chaos, and they looked really good going forward. And yet I'd seen them a few weeks before at home to Sunderland, and they played like they played in the playoff final, where they had all of the ball and could have still been playing now and didn't look like they were going to score. I mean, James had that one that hit the woodwork, didn't he? But I thought they were disappointing, Leeds. And you do look at that squad. Are they going to be able to keep Somerville? I would doubt it. Nonto's a disappointment, isn't it? Because he looked a superstar potentially in the Premier League. And I know he had that bit at the start of last season where it seemed like he was spitting his dummy out a bit because he wanted to move and didn't get one. But then he seemed to knuckle back down. But then he just offered nothing, really, which is a disappointment from them. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a classic playoff final, was it? It wasn't a... Playoff finals tend to either be end-to-end tear-ups or relatively cagey that finish 1-0. And clearly this was in the latter camp.
Well, there you go. Your latest Boro vid with a sprinkling of Sunderland and Leeds thrown in there as well.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for watching. As ever, thanks for listening. If you are watching on YouTube, then do tap subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll be back next week with our latest episode of You Are My Boro. Enjoy your weekend. Take care.